Hi everyone, this is John Talks Sci-Fi, with me, John. The topic is infodumping, techsplaining, or smartsplaining, physics woo, and how I've dealt with that in my writing. Now, I've read in writing guides and articles and so forth the advice to avoid infodumping. And after careful consideration and some research, I think that in many cases that doesn't apply as much to science fiction as in traditional fiction. So let's take a look at it. In infodumping, you'll see long pieces of narration and even sometimes dialogue where there isn't anything happening in the scene other than just a description of and some information or content that the writer wants the reader to know. Sometimes there just isn't a straightforward way to get the information out to the reader, though, without it being essentially just a description or exposition in some aspect of the story or plot. Now, if it's backstory for a fictional character, sometimes that's accomplished with flashbacks, and that can become part of a scene, and sometimes character internal monologue, and that's where you see some cases of infodumping. And of course, through dialogue, you can have it too. Some things aren't easy to present that way, and I feel like some degree of this sort of exposition, though, is why I read science fiction in the first place. You want the info dump. I want to hear about all that crazy tech and the history of those, alien organization and how they expanded into the galaxy. And if there's not a way for one to tell the other to explain it, I don't want it to read like an encyclopedia of the known universe, of course, but you do sometimes want that. You crave the tell me more about the history of that milieu that you've got going on. In my book, I had a character enter the story, and he didn't know anything about what was going on and had to ask a lot of questions. So in the story, that was a natural thing for him to do, and his role and his occupation actually within the plot made it reasonable for the other characters to give him that information in chunks and pieces. So that was a tidy way to solve the problem of needing, and of course my wanting, to get that information out to the reader. That's how I managed also the techsplaining. Getting some of that technical information into the story, since this guy didn't know it. You don't want someone just, in a monologue or narrating to themselves about how some encryption system works or whatnot, how the alien drive works. It's a trick to have them have to tell someone who just doesn't know. They're the new guy. I'm sure you've read stories where one character knows much more about some tech or some other element of the story and smartsplains it to another character. This is less formalized, than the previous example. One character just knows about something, and the other wouldn't have a way to, and tells them when it comes up, even if they just know it, and that gets wrapped into the narrative. If you had something like, Jules felt sweat seeping into the palms of her hands. She knew that she only had seconds remaining to complete the Python code that would bypass the encryption. Serplorg encryption was tough, and used multi-dimensional elliptic curve algorithms with tens of thousands of bits for its encryption keys. And there I described the programming language, the encryption. An external observer or narrator wouldn't know that, unless they were omniscient in that method. We could have her say that in dialogue to another character, of course, but that might be awkward. In this case, there wasn't another character available in the scene with them. And if you want to convey that information, you have a limited number of channels to do so within the content. Now, dumping is usually a longer blob of stuff unrelated to that narrative. She was actually doing that in this arbitrary example I cooked up. So this wouldn't quite qualify. It could easily veer in that direction if I wandered off into more discussion about how she learned programming in her childhood, how she worked with encryption in college for years. That sort of backstory when she's in the middle of a short time ticking down and sweating over having to get some code done, that would really qualify, as you can see, as a big info dump. So when I think about it, though, in other stories, as I mentioned earlier, some of those big dumps are really great. I feel like I recall loving it when an author digs into why some alien race does this or that because of history, some earlier war, how they perceive things differently because of some biological history, this or that. I want the dump. As long as it doesn't go on so long that you forget what the heck is happening in the plot line or the scene, or you forget why you care about what you're learning about, and I think it's fine. Part of the complaint about these comes from an omniscient third-person narrator doing it, just going into detail about things to provide context and backstory. If you can get the info in with a character thinking about it or talking or so forth without going off the rails, it comes through more naturally and makes more sense. You want to get the information across in the least obtrusive or awkward way possible. And obviously, I feel the same way about explanations of physics and physics woo, as we call it, in my stories. Telling some, but not too much of it is a little bit tricky for me sometimes. I put a lot of science and then science-y stuff in The Way of the Den. I have plenty of starting point physics that was taken from the real world, the real science, and then there's that jumping off point into the fictional universe of the story where, it's not science anymore. It's the fiction that we all love. And you're into the perhaps, but not likely possible or impossible as the case may be. And I want to talk about that in detail in another podcast. Thanks for listening if you still are. Subscribe if you're enjoying this.